Excited. We're in DC, so we thought, what could be better than talking to someone who grew up in the White House at a very inspirational age of 18. And it's funny, sitting there, he goes, well, my dad became president. Like, how many people get to say that? Not many. So we are going to have a very inspirational conversation with Steve Ford. I'm excited. He has the most amazing background. Not only is he a son of a president and got to come in and out of the White House, he's a highly sought motivational speaker, also accomplished actor. For those of you who watch The Young and Restless, he was on a long time on that, as well as 30 feature films, including Black Hawk Down, Contract, Armageddon, and When Harry Met Sally. I'd love to know what you were doing in that movie. We'll have to talk about that more. He's also involved in thoroughbred racing industry, and before that, he was also a professional rodeo circuit as a team roper. I mean, talk about an amazing background. And he's also the son of former President Ford. So I'd like to welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you. Dawn, thank you very much. That was a great introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to all those things. In Harry Met Sally, I had one small scene. I played her ex-boyfriend, Joe. And I'm the guy that dumps her so she can end up with Billy Crystal. And so they actually paid me to kiss Meg Ryan. So that was a good job. That was a good job. Welcome. I grew up here just across the river in Alexandria, Virginia. My father was a congressman for 26 years from the state of Michigan. And somehow, eventually, we got some good government housing is the kind of way it worked out. It's funny, out here in the hall, you could have invited the Bush girls, Chelsea Clinton, whatever, and we all get asked the same question. If you're the son or daughter of a former president, it doesn't matter where you go. The question you get, and I get asked out here 2 or 3 times already, is how often do you get back to the White House? And there's this misconception that once you live in the White House, they give you like this magical key that gets you in there anytime you want, and that's just not true. Dad left office in January 1977 after Jimmy Carter got sworn in, and that was the last time I was in the White House until about almost 25 years later. And President Bush in 2003 was kind enough to invite my dad and the whole family. They had a big birthday party for my dad, his 90th birthday, and it was almost to the exact date that he'd been sworn in as president about 30 years earlier. So we come back to the White House. I haven't been there in, over 25 years. And President Bush says, you want to go over to the Oval Office? And I'm sure, I haven't been there. So my 2 brothers and my sister and I, mom and dad, would go over to the Oval Office. And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, I was 18-year-old kid when Dad was president. I'm saying, wow, I was in the Oval Office, and so then after that, and it really hadn't changed. It looks the same and everything. It's still oval, promise you that. Then we go over, they had a big dinner for Dad, but we went up to the family quarters that are on the 2nd floor of the White House. They had a little small reception with just the Bush family and some dignitaries, and I'm sort of caught in my, thoughts of, my word, I used to live in this place, and I'm walking through, and I'm sort of caught in my dreams of what it was like, and there's a screen door that leads out onto a balcony that overlooks the south lawn of the White House. And I walk through that screen door, sort of caught in my thoughts, and I stop, and I look to my left, and in a perfect line is Vice President Dick Cheney, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, and then me. And it's like one of those pictures you see, and underneath it, it says, what doesn't belong here, So I asked Alan Greenspan to leave. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. Well, listen, Dawn asked me to come and share some stories about our time in the White House, what it was like, some of the funny little stories and anecdotes. And as you can see, I brought some pictures. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you're going to realize that there are real families that live there. And this is a picture of our family back in 1975, the cover of Time magazine. That's my sister Susan on the left, myself, my brother Jack, my brother Mike, and his wife Gail. And hopefully when you walk out of here, you're going to realize they're real families. They go through all the same things you go through. My life was just like yours. Yes, I admit, I had better government housing than you had, but this is going to be sort of a down memory lane. And then I look in the audience, and some of you are young enough, you may not even remember the story of how Dad got literally catapulted into the White House overnight, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. This is a picture of the old Air Force One. This is an old 707, and if you go to the Reagan Museum out in California, you can actually walk through this plane. It hangs in the Reagan Museum, this old plane, and at the time it was state-of-the-art. It was the best technology America had. The president flew on Air Force One. Today it's a big 747. I've flown on that plane too. And it basically makes this plane look like the Wright brothers' plane. So technology has come a long way since when we were there. Oh, I put this slide in last night. I got a quiz for you. This picture was taken the day after Dad lost the election to Jimmy Carter. We're down in the Oval Office. Dad's getting ready to go give his conciliatory speech of losing to Carter. That's my sister Susan on the left. That's me giving my mom a hug in the Oval Office. Anybody recognize the man in the middle? That's your former Vice President Dick Cheney. He was a 32-year-old chief of staff, the youngest chief of staff in White House history, and he had that warm, friendly smile back then too, you know, so some things never change, do they? Let's see what else we have. Oh, this is a picture of Mom, the Queen of England. Yeah, the Queen came over for the bicentennial. It was a big deal. Of course, Mom had to wear the bigger hat. But the Queen came over for the 200th birthday of America. And they had a state dinner for the Queen and her husband, Prince Philip. And what happens at a state dinner, you know, everybody gets dressed up. This was not only black tie, it was white tie and tails for the Queen. And what happens is the President and the First Lady go down the family elevator and they go meet the dignitary, the Queen at that time, at the diplomatic entrance to the White House. And then they take them back up the family elevator. They sit and chat for 10, 15 minutes, and then they walk down the grand staircase to the East Room of the White House for the big dinner. So Mom gets all dressed up, Dad gets all dressed up. They go down to the diplomatic entrance, and they meet the Queen and Prince Philip. They're walking them in, and my mother and the Queen are standing at the family elevator waiting to go up to the second floor. And what my mother doesn't realize is that my 21-year-old brother Jack hasn't finished dressing for the state dinner. He's in the basement of the White House. He's coming up the elevator, and all he has on is a pair of Levi's and no shirt. My mother is standing at the elevator with the Queen, and you ladies can imagine, my mother was horrified when the doors opened, and there's her 21-year-old son standing there in jeans and no shirt. Thank God the Queen had a sense of humor, and she looks at my mother and she goes, "Don't worry, Betty, I have one of those at home too." And I got thinking, who would that have been? That would have been Prince Charles at that time. So, yes, we're all getting a little bit older. So, I was telling Dawn before I came up here, I used to rodeo and cowboy professionally. That's me on the right. I was a team roper. I rodeoed professionally for quite a while, but I wasn't any good. I was going to starve to death the way I rodeoed, but I had a lot of fun, a lot of great stories. And I'll show you a picture here of how bad I was. This is a picture of me getting bucked off what we call a bareback horse. And I didn't bring this picture to show you how bad I brought this picture to show you. The guy on the fence up there with the sunglasses on, that's my Secret Service agent. Now, I was always under the impression they were there to protect me. And if my life got in great danger, they were going to leap into action. And if we go to the next picture, you'll see my life is in greater danger here. He has not moved. Wait a second, you laugh. That's your federal tax dollars at work there, so be careful what you're laughing at. So, but cowboy and rodeo got me in the TV and film business. I spent 8 years on the show, The Young and the Restless, for CBS, and then started working in movies like Black Hawk Down, Transformers, Contact with Jodie Foster. Worked on a movie, Black Hawk Down. This was on the set. We're dressed as two of the real special ops guys, the Delta Force. The two guys in civilian clothes are two of the real Delta soldiers that fought in Somalia in the early 90s, where we lost 18 brave American soldiers. And we, like many other nations, had gone into Somalia because there were there were millions of people starving there. And we went in there for humanitarian aid with many other countries, and we got caught in a firefight with... Actually, what had happened, a man that we didn't even know what his name was at that time had gone to Somalia to train the Somalis how to shoot down U.S. helicopters because they learned how to do it against the Russians in the late 80s in Afghanistan. And that man was bin Laden. In the early 90s, we didn't even know his name. He'd gone to Somalia, and we lost 18 brave American soldiers there. And here we are 25 plus years later, and we're still fighting pirates off the coast of Somalia. So not much has changed in the world sometimes. Well, let me... Gosh, I look out in the audience, there's some young people here. You guys don't even know this story, how my father got catapulted into the White House. It's because of that man right there. That was Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president. Spiro Agnew got caught in a bribery scandal, had to step down from office. And Richard Nixon was looking for a new vice president. Now, my dad, as you heard earlier, had been a congressman for 26 years. He was the House Minority Leader in Congress. He was head of the Republican Party. They were in the minority, but my dad was actually getting ready to retire from Congress. But his name was put on a list of 3 or 4 people that might be chosen by Nixon, President Nixon, to be the next vice president. Now, we didn't take it very seriously, I'll be honest with you. The top of that list, probably would have been former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, former governor of Texas. Earlier had been a Democrat. John Connally switched over to the Republican Party, but Jerry Ford's name probably didn't seem like it was on the top of that list. Everybody on that list was told that at 7:30 that night, the White House was going to call whoever they chose to be the next vice president. And then they were going to invite that person to the White House at 9 o'clock, do a special press conference, and introduce the new vice president. Now, sort of put this story in perspective. We lived across the Potomac River from here in Alexandria, Virginia. We had a little 3-bedroom house. We had 2 different telephone lines in our house. One was a public line listed in the phone book, probably 3 or 4 extensions throughout the house. The other was a private line that was in my parents' bedroom, and there was only 1 extension. It was an unlisted phone number. We're having dinner. 7:30 that night, the private line rings in my parents' bedroom. My sister Susan picks it up, yells downstairs, "Dad, it's the White House." We all get up from the dinner table. We walk upstairs. Dad picks up the phone, and on the other end of that phone is General Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff at the time. And General Haig says to my father, he says, "Congressman Ford, the President of the United States has something that he thinks both you and your wife Betty should hear at the same time. Can you put your wife Betty on?" And before my dad could tell him this was a private line with only 1 extension, the President of the United States gets on the phone. And the next thing we hear my dad say is, "Mr. President, if you could just call back on the other line, Betty could get on," and he hangs up. Now, listen, I was only 17 years old, but even I knew that probably wasn't a career move. I just sensed that, and I had visions of, what about if they don't know the other phone number, right? Yeah, I got Al Haig and Richard Nixon going through the phone book, right? It's Jerry Ford, right, Al, Jerry. Well, honest to God, this is how history is made, people. We sat there for 5 minutes. It got very still, very quiet, little rumblings in the back, way to go, Dad. But finally, 5 minutes later, the President of the United States calls back on the other line so that my mother could be on the phone with Dad and they could share that moment together as they'd shared so many other moments in their marriage. That was October of 1974. Dad becomes vice president. At that time, Watergate had not grown to what it would. But we all know our history, and over the next 10 months, the Nixon presidency was under siege. And 10 months later, this is a famous picture of my parents walking the Nixons out on the south lawn of the White House after he had resigned. I think everybody remembers this picture right here of Richard Nixon saying goodbye to his staff, family, friends on the south lawn of the White House. We sat there. We were about 30 feet from the helicopter as Nixon waved goodbye, and we backed off as the helicopter took off. And, you know, most presidents, you win an election, you get galas, you get parties and balls and parades, and it's a celebration. That's not what this was. This was a dark cloud hanging over the White House. The White House had been disgraced. We backed off, and we were getting ready to go into the East Room of the White House where my dad would put his hand on a Bible, take the oath of office, and become President of the United States. Think about it. Dad was walking, this was a constitutional crisis. This had never happened in the history of America, that a man was going to take the oath of office that had not gone through an election, been on a ticket, been confirmed by the American people. He had been appointed vice president and now was going to assume the presidency without an election. Most countries that happens, there's usually troops in the streets, not America. We'd figured out a way to do it. You think about what he was going to inherit as he walked into the White House. The country was going through a recession. We had a war in Vietnam. We had a Cold War with the Russians. In fact, I'll back up for just a second. 12 months before, 12 months before Dad was going to take the reins of the presidency, 12 months before Nixon resigned, there was an energy crisis. The price of oil in America and around the world was $3 to $4 a barrel. Over the next 12 months leading up to Nixon's resignation, the price of oil went up 300% to 400% to $12 a barrel. The stock market, 6 months before Nixon resigned, was just hovering over 1,000 points. In the next 6 months leading up to his resignation, it lost 42%. There was a recession. Unemployment was 10%. Inflation was approaching 14%. You had a war in Vietnam, a Cold War with the Russians. It was a constitutional crisis. My dad walked in to the East Room of the White House. He put his hand on the Bible. Mom held it, took the oath of office, and became the next president of the United States without being elected. Kids all sat in the front row. We watched Dad get sworn in. This was our first family photo after Dad became president. We walked into the Oval Office. Nixon had cleared off his desk. Dad and the family walked in, and we took our first official photo in the Oval Office. Now think about it. 10 months earlier, my dad was a congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, getting ready to retire. My mother was so tired of politics, she said, "Jerry, you got to retire." And he said, "If the Republicans don't get the majority, and which would mean I would become Speaker of the House, I'll retire, I'll go back to Michigan, we'll have a nice quiet life, I'll be a lawyer again." Well, all of a sudden, Dad gets appointed vice president. My mother was not happy. But I'll never forget my dad. He comes up at the dinner table, he puts his arm around my mother, and he goes, "Don't worry, Betty, vice presidents don't do anything." Didn't really work out that way, did it? 10 months earlier, I used to walk by the White House like you could today and look through the bars and wonder what the heck they do in there. And here, 10 months later, I'm actually in there still wondering what the heck we do in here. But that's how quick history changed our life. So think, think about this. that night, after Dad becomes president, we can't move into the White House. Nixon resigned so quickly, so unexpectedly, that they couldn't pack up all their belongings. And so they left their son and their daughter and son-in-law, David Eisenhower, at the White House. It took 7 days to pack up all their clothes and belongings. Even though the Nixons had left, we couldn't move in. So that night, we have to go back to our little house in Alexandria, Virginia, right, suburbia. And this is a picture of our first meal after Dad becomes president of the United States in our little 3-bedroom house in Alexandria, Virginia. And you ladies out there will get a kick out of this. I'll never forget my mother standing over the stove that night cooking, right, going, "Jerry, something's wrong here. You just became president of the United States and I'm still cooking." I mean, but that was literally what happened. The next morning, Dad, for 7 days, had to get up every morning and commute to the White House. And that's just the way it was. Now, can you imagine trying to do that today? It just would not work. So, well, let me get into a little more of the details of what we went through. Dad inherited, you heard what, inflation, 14% unemployment, close to 10%, energy crisis, war in Vietnam. Soldiers were still coming home from Vietnam in body bags. This country was being ripped apart. You had college campuses everywhere with protests, and the nation was basically under siege from the right and the left. And it was a terrible time to be president of the United States. Now, it's interesting. When Dad took over office, he was only in office less than 1,000 days, about the same as John F. Kennedy, 2.5 years. And when he left office, the stock market was back over 1,000 points. Unemployment had been cut. They'd cut inflation from 14% down to 4%. The economy was moving again. All the troops were home from Vietnam. The war was over. So things were going well when he left office, but that's not what he's remembered for, is it? What's the one thing my father is remembered for? I heard one of them, the pardon of Richard Nixon. That will be his legacy forever as a president. And if he were here today, I know the story he would tell you, and so I'm going to try to repeat what he might say to you. The pardon of Richard Nixon defined his presidency and actually cost him an election. They figured the Nixon pardon cost him anywhere from 7 to 15% of the vote. When he ran against Jimmy Carter, he lost by 1%. Actually, one of the first things he did, he had to go against his own attorney general days after Nixon had resigned. And it really wasn't his attorney general because Nixon had appointed him. He inherited Nixon's attorney general. But Nixon wanted all the papers, documents, and tapes sent to California after he arrived there. And Dad said absolutely not. There was still a potential criminal trial pending, and all those boxes of evidence and tapes and paper, they would be evidence at a trial. And there were so many of these boxes, they were on the second floor of the White House. The Secret Service was afraid the ceiling was going to collapse. They were stacked to the ceiling. And basically Nixon wanted them all in San Clemente, and Dad's... I mean, look, let's face it. Everybody knew what was going to happen. If all those got sent to California, the next morning there would be a huge bonfire on the beach. I mean, that's basically what was going to happen. So Dad had to go against his own attorney general, excuse me, who had ruled that every former president owns his papers, documents, tapes. But Dad held it at the White House as evidence. He invited in Lee and Jaworski, who was a special prosecutor. And he asked him, how long can Richard Nixon delay a trial? And Lee and Jaworski said 3, 4, maybe 5 years. And I think at that point, that's what changed my dad's mind. And he started thinking of, we've got to get Richard Nixon out of the way so we can heal the nation, so we can heal the recession, the war in Vietnam, all these things that are going on. Because Nixon was in the headlines. And they knew they couldn't get Nixon to say he did anything wrong. That was not going to happen. Now, later, he wrote books about it and admitted the cover-up and all those things. But At that time, he was not going to say anything. So they found a Supreme Court ruling. It was called the Burdick case. And it was from 1930s, I think, early 30s. And it was a case where the feds had a man named Mr. Burdick in custody. And they told him, they said, we'll give you a pardon if you'll testify at our case. And Mr. Burdick turned their pardon down because the Supreme Court had ruled that, Don, if I grant you a pardon, it's an implication of your guilt. If you accept that pardon, you accept that guilt. Mr. Burdick said, I haven't done anything wrong. I don't want your pardon. I don't want to accept that guilt. So Mr. Burdick turned the pardon down. They went to Nixon and they said, we're going to grant a pardon under these conditions of the Burdick case. And Nixon initially turned it down, wouldn't accept it. 3 or 4 days later, he finally came back and accepted the pardon. Now, it changed my dad's political career, ended it. He knew it was going to end his political career because of the pardon. But if he were here today, he would tell you the same thing. He was thinking long-term, not short-term for his own political career. He was thinking about healing a nation and moving on, than trying to get reelected in 2 years. Cost him an election, but about 20 years later, he got probably the greatest award he's ever received in his life. And this is a picture of him at the John F. Kennedy Museum and Library with Caroline Kennedy and Senator Ted Kennedy. And he got the John F. Kennedy Award for Courage, Profiles in Courage, because of the Nixon pardon. And Senator Ted Kennedy stood up there and said, Mr. President, 20 years ago, I was wrong, you were right. I told the country you sold it out when you pardoned Richard Nixon, but you did the courageous thing, the thing that healed the nation. And I tell you that story only because trust me, on that Sunday when Dad signed the pardon 30 days after he'd gotten into office, when he signed that pardon on a Sunday afternoon, trust me, I don't think he ever thought Senator Ted Kennedy was going to be inviting him to a ceremony at the Kennedy Library. He did it because he was looking long-term, not short-term. We live in a society today that wants everything now, now, now. That's an example of a long-term decision. Well, my life wasn't quite as complicated as Dad's. This is a picture of me up at Camp David getting off Marine One, the helicopter with Dad and Mom. I was an 18-year-old kid. I was telling Dawn and the table here. My dad, when he became president in August of 1974, I had just earlier been accepted to Duke University. I was going to go to Duke University my freshman year, and all of a sudden Dad becomes president. I get 10 Secret Service agents, right? Trust me, at 18 years old, that is not the group you're hoping to hang out with. I've got visions of trying to move in the freshman dorm at Duke with guys with machine guns and radios, and it's not really working for me. So I walk into my dad's office, and I say, Dad, I'm just not ready to go to college right now. This whole thing with you becoming president. He said, okay, well, fine. What is your plan? And I said, Dad, I just want to take a year off. And he goes, like any good father should. He goes, what's your plan for that year off? And I go, Dad, I just want to go out west. I've always had this dream, this vision to go out west and be a cowboy. And he's like, what? A cowboy? What? And you know, going out west and being a cowboy was about one notch above starting a rock and roll band in the garage, right? So now, thank God I had parents that allowed us kids to kind of find our own way. And I didn't go to Duke University. I took my 10 Secret Service guys and I headed west. And it was like, oh God, what was the movie Billy Crystal did? Yes, City Slickers, right? Okay, so here's a picture of me and my 10 guys. These are my Secret Service guys. That's me in the lower right-hand corner, and those are my 10 guys. And every once in a while, we'd have to put them on a horse. It was like a giant posse, okay? Aren't you glad to see what your tax dollars were doing back in 1974? Now, most of the time, if I was working on a ranch, cowboy, and a rodeo, they could usually follow me in a pickup truck or something like that. But every once in a while, we had to put them on a horse. And we had this one occasion, this ranch I worked on up outside of Missoula, Montana. In the summertime, we ran all our cattle up on the mountains, up in the Forest Service land. And at the end of the summer, we'd have to gather them off. And there was always one or two old wild cows that were up there that we couldn't catch, so we'd have to go look for them. So we had 2 or 3 wild old cows up there. Forest Service called us and said, you need to get them off the mountain. Hunting season is coming up. Somebody's going to shoot them. So we loaded up a truck and a stock trailer. I put 3 horses in the stock trailer, one for myself, one for this other cowboy who worked on the ranch, and one for the Secret Service agent who had just transferred in from Miami, Florida. We get to the top of the mountain, I'm unloading the horses, I take my horse out, I take this other cowboy's horse out, and I'm just getting ready to take the Secret Service guy's horse out, and I hear this voice behind me go, psst, psst, oh, oh, and I turn around, it's the Secret Service guy, and I go, what's the problem? He goes, why don't you leave my horse in there? I go, what are you talking about? He goes, oh, look, we're out in the middle of nowhere. Why don't you just leave my horse in there? I'll stay here. He says, nobody's going to kidnap you or shoot you. He goes, nobody's up here. So I'm fine. You know, this guy didn't ride a horse very well. So I said, fine, we'll leave your horse here. And he says, why don't you guys just go play cowboy? You'll come back here in a couple hours. We'll all go home together. Nobody's going to know the difference. Well, that's fine. So we left the Secret Service guy there with his horse. Myself, this other cowboy, we take off. We ride for 2 or 3 hours. Don't find any cattle. We're headed back to the trailer. And I look over, and this other cowboy on his saddle has a lever-action Winchester 30-30 hunting rifle, because we carried that because we'd run into grizzly bears. And I get to thinking, wouldn't it be funny if we shot this gun off 3 or 4 times in the air, just so we knew the Secret Service guy would hear it, and as we get close to the truck, I'll get off my horse and lay over the saddle like I've been shot, and we'll see what he thinks of staying at the truck, right? So you see where this is going, and you only do this when you're 18 years old, right? And so we shoot this gun off 3 or 4 times in the air. We know the Secret Service guy hears it. We get close to the truck. I take off my cowboy hat and hang it over the horn of my saddle. I hand the reins to this other cowboy. He takes my horse. I climb up and lay over the saddle like I've been shot. He comes riding around the corner, leading my horse. I'm over the saddle. The Secret Service guy looks up, sees me over the saddle. First words out of his mouth, he goes, my career, my career. Does not ask if I'm dead or alive, right? So, oh my God. Well, I've got a little time remaining here, and I've got a couple pictures you won't see anyplace else. This is truly behind the scenes pictures of the life in the White House. This first picture is at a state dinner in Japan, and Dad was the first president to go to Japan since World War II, and it was a great honor. But they had a head table, and they have this custom where you pass a wooden reed from one guest to the next, but the only way you can do it is you got to hold it between your upper lip and your nose, right? And you can see Dad's not really excited about this. But I want to show you what he was willing to do for the American people, right? So he swore that was not on his job description. But so men, okay, the next picture. This is for all the men in the room, guys. Guys, this will prove to you that our life in the White House was just like your life at home, okay? This next picture is going to show you who truly ran the White House. You guys have never had that look at home, have you? Yeah, I think we know who's going to win that argument right there. Well, let me close with a few stories on a more serious note. And about 3 months before my dad passed away, he died in 2006. I was in a federal prison, and okay, that sounded funny. I was not in prison, okay? But I was in a prison doing kind of what my parents had taught me to do. They were public servants, and my parents had taught me that, you know, if you can reach out and help other people, you add more value to your own life. And I was there because I was there speaking at a special program. I'd been there twice. It was a program for men in prison that were drug addicts, alcoholics. I've got 25 years of sobriety due to the grace of God, and my own 12-step program kept me sober. And I go share that in prisons and juvenile detention facilities and schools and places like that. So I'm in this prison trying to help some men that want to get out of prison and make sure they're not absentee fathers when they get home, or drug addicts and things like that. So this is about 3 months before Dad passes away. And I tell my story and how I stayed sober and some things like that. And we do a question and answer thing afterwards. And this young man stands up and he says, tell us a great story about your dad's career, his accomplishments, you know, vice president, president, and all that kind of stuff. And I sort of take a deep breath and I say, son, you know, you wouldn't know this, but my dad's very ill right now. He's going to probably pass away very soon, in a month or two, maybe 3-4 months. And, you know, we're just waiting for him. He's 93 years old. And I said to that young man, I said, you know, when I think of Dad and when I'm going to be at a state funeral in Washington, D.C. after Dad dies, I said, I just have this distinct feeling that at that moment, his greatest value to me as a father will not be what he did as his job. His greatest value is not going to be dealing with the Russians on nuclear talks, or dealing with the Chinese, or bringing the troops home from Vietnam, or cutting inflation, or you know, creating financial policy, or dealing with our allies. That's not going to be his greatest value to me when I can imagine myself sitting on the Capitol steps watching his state funeral. And I said, I think his greatest value at that moment will probably be how he led our family, how he showed us how to be a great father, how he showed us how to be a great husband. That's going to be his greatest value to me, not what he did in his career or his profession. And sure enough, 3 months later, Dad passed away, and I was at that state funeral, and I didn't think about what he did to cut inflation or create jobs. I thought about what he did to lead our family. That same young man stood back up, and he said, well, then, if you're not going to tell us about his accomplishments, his career, tell us about who he was, the character of him, his integrity, the fabric of who he was as a man. And so I thought about it, and there were a bunch of stories I could have shared with these prisoners, and I'm going to share the same story today with you that I did with those 200 men in that prison, that federal prison. If I could only tell you one story about who my dad was, it would be this story right here. It's sort of the pearl of stories about my father. He played football at the University of Michigan. There we go. And they retired his jersey about 20 years ago. We were back at the University of Michigan and stood on the field in Ann Arbor at the big house. And I haven't seen my father cry much, but he cried that day. And this is a picture of him when he played football at the University of Michigan. President Lyndon Johnson used to say about my dad, Jerry Ford played too much football without a football helmet, you know, and they were best friends. They were very good friends, but this is a picture of his team. Dad was number 48, captain of the team. After the ceremony, when they retired the jersey, you saw that picture, I was walking off the field, and a man pulled me aside, and he says, I want to tell you a story about your father when he played football here at the University of Michigan in the early 30s. He says, your dad in 32 and 33 played on two national championship teams, 10-0 both seasons. Michigan was national champions. In 1934, your dad was captain of the team, and that year Michigan was supposed to play a team, Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech found out that Michigan had one black player on its team, number 61, Willis Ward. And Georgia Tech said they would not take the field, they would not play the game if Willis Ward suited up for that game. Well, Willis Ward and my dad were best of friends. They roomed together when the team traveled. But this was the old Jim Crow laws of the 30s, and when the schools from the South came up to play the schools in the North, the northern schools would bench their black players. That was just the custom. That was done at hundreds of universities. Well, the man who was telling me this story said, your father was so incensed that his good friend Willis Ward couldn't play in that game that he was going to quit the University of Michigan football team to make a stand for his friend Willis Ward. Now, Willis, who was a star of the team, found out that Dad was going to quit, and he went to my father and he says, Jerry, you got to play. He says, I'm going to sit down, I'll be benched, but you've got to play. You're captain of the team. He convinced my dad to go back on the team. Now remember, Michigan had come off 2 undefeated seasons, 10-0, national champions. This season, the next one, 1934, their record was 1-8. They won 1 game, and they lost 8. But the only game they won, they beat Georgia Tech 9-2. I'd never heard that story about my father. I was standing on the field, I had tears running down my eyes. And that man looked at me and he said, son, do you know what character is? And I couldn't speak. He says, character's what you do when nobody's watching, and nobody was watching your father as a young 20-year-old kid at the University of Michigan. I tell you that story because I walked off that field and I thought, my gosh, what kind of stories are my kids or grandkids going to be telling about me? I don't have any Willis Ward, so I'm a recovering alcoholic. I'm trying to rewrite the script of my life, but that's an important question to ask. What kind of stories are your kids or grandkids going to be telling about you? That's the greatest value I put on my dad's life. Not what he did in his career, not what he did as president or vice president. It's how he led our family. Thank you guys very much. God bless you. Thank you.
Steve, we have time for a couple questions.
Yeah.
Okay?
Dawn just asked if I had some time for Q&A questions. Do they have some mics so we can ask some questions?
So,
I'm happy to answer questions. So,
John Powell and Bree, where are you? Okay, come on over here to the center. These are your microphones, and we're going to toss them to you.
Somebody asked me while we're finding somebody out in the hallway, when did you lose your Secret Service? And I was actually in California playing, when Jimmy Carter got inaugurated, I was playing cards with my Secret Service in their command post. We were watching the inauguration on TV. And as soon as Carter took the oath of office, all of a sudden the phone rang in the command post, and the Secret Service guy picks it up and goes, yeah, got it. Hung up the phone, and they started folding chairs and tables, and they were gone. That quick, literally. And I'm sitting there going, what is that? I got a good hand. You can't leave now, you know? But literally, they left that quickly. Today, that does not happen. The Bush girls, Chelsea Clinton, the Obama girls, because of the world is a much more dangerous place, they phase it out because this country, because of ISIS, because of Al-Qaeda, can you imagine after President Obama left office, 2 weeks later, one of his girls gets kidnapped by ISIS? It'd be terrible, make this country look so weak. So today they would phase it out over 6 months, but literally back in '76, we were in the middle of a card game and they were folding chairs. So, different world today. Question?
We have one back here.
So, Mr. Ford, I don't know if you can hear me, okay. If you could validate a story, so it's family story. Was your dad World War II Navy pre-flight instructor at St. Mary's College?
My dad was a pre-flight. He went in the Navy. He enlisted World War II. He wanted to be a pilot, but his eyes weren't good enough, and he ended up on an aircraft carrier, but not as a pilot. He was a lieutenant commander, a navigator on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, and fought the whole war in the Pacific. And the big thing that happened to the ships he was on, he was in a famous storm called the Halsey's Typhoon, and it's still the greatest maritime disaster ever. He was on an aircraft carrier, and the whole fleet sailed into a typhoon in the Pacific. They didn't have the radar they have now. And they got in this huge typhoon. My dad was called to the bridge because there was a fire on the hangar deck. It was wartime, and so all the planes were left with fuel, and these planes were sliding around on the hangar deck, and they'd gotten loose and ignited a fire, and he was called to the bridge. He was head of the fire brigade. And as he was going up to the bridge, the ship listed about 25 degrees, and he went sliding across the carrier deck. And he said the only thing that saved him, there was a little 2-inch lip on the carrier deck. He was headed for the ocean, and his heels hit it, and it stopped him. He finally got to the fire and the bridge, and they put the fire out. But they lost 2 of their engines in the middle of the night, and the next morning they woke up, and 2 destroyers had rolled over in the middle of the night. They lost 900 men. And it was called Halsey's Typhoon. I think it's still the greatest maritime disaster. So we just dedicated or commissioned an aircraft carrier named after Dad this last summer. It's the USS Gerald R. Ford. And it is getting ready to go to sea. And I stood there with the captain, and he told me the life of these carriers is so long. He says the last captain of this ship has not been born yet. So that ship will be 50, 60 years working for the Navy. So, yeah. Another question.
Steve, we have another question over here.
Yep. Good catch.
That was close. So, Ted Newberger, Becton Dickinson, and Mr. Ford, I want to say thank you. Very inspiring talk, and your dad must be looking down and being very proud of you.
Oh,
so
thanks.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. He was a good father. Thank you.
So, question I have, if you think your dad would have any advice for the current U.S. president, what would that be?
That might be a long talk. I'll tell you one story that I think will sum up everything. My dad's best friend was the Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. They fought on the floor of Congress when he was a congressman and when he was president. And Tip was a Democrat, Dad was a Republican, but they would hammer out some compromise. They would find some common ground. And after they fought all day on Congress, we'd have Tip O'Neill over at our house. He'd be at our house for dinner that night. That's the way it worked back then. There was not this toxic, what we have today. And so I think that answers some of your question. There's a famous story of my dad and Tip O'Neill playing golf, and their dad's president, Tip O'Neill's the Speaker of the House, and they're on the golf course, and Tip puts his arm around my dad, and he goes, "Mr. President, Jerry, God, isn't this a great country where you and I can be great friends out here on the golf course?" And he says, 13 months from now, when the campaign starts back up, I'm going to be traveling around the country trying to kick your butt. And they fought, but there was a respect that we don't have today. And my dad has a statue. It's the last statue to be put in the rotunda at the Capitol. And we had to find quotes for the statue at the base of it. And I found about 30 quotes from my mother or dad's speeches and stuff. But there was one quote that wasn't dad's, and she read through them all. And she came back to me. She says, "This is a quote I want on the front." And it wasn't a quote from Dad. It was a quote from his good friend Tip O'Neill. And Tip O'Neill, and I'm going to paraphrase, but very close, wrote in his book, "God has been very good to America. During the Civil War, he sent Abraham Lincoln, and during Watergate, he sent Gerald R. Ford, the right man at the right time to heal a nation." And when you have a Democratic leader of Congress say that about a Republican, that tells you we don't live in that time anymore. It's a different world out there. So,
Thank you. That was a great answer. Folks, we are out of time. We can't take any more questions, so you have to toss the microphone back in. I'm sorry. But I want to thank you. That was an inspiring talk.